The date would be somewhere in the early 1400s, perhaps on Zheng's sixth voyage, which happened in 1421 to 1422. The Chinese sailors under Zheng reached California in 1422, which would be 70 years before Columbus even sets foot in the Americas. About 20,000 men, much more than the 86 to 89 men under Columbus. Also, unlike the Europeans, the Chinese would eat a diet of soybeans, rice, wheat, and millet, with the soybeans providing some crucial vitamin C. Without scurvy and much more sanitary conditions than what the Europeans had, the Chinese only lose perhaps a few dozen men out of their many thousands. So imagine basically a small town of Chinese waiting up the shores of California, with huge treasure ships in the background. Basically, it will look really awesome. The Chinese spread out, surprised at the foreign land of vegetation, and finally meet the natives. Unlike Columbus, the Chinese will obviously know that they are on a new continent that they have never seen before. Accustomed to foreign peoples and nations already, it is likely that the Chinese encounter with Native Americans will be much more peaceful than that with the Europeans. The Chinese trade whatever they can, although the natives will only fit the Chinese notion that other groups had less advanced civilizations. A few dozen men are left behind with supplies, and they eventually intermarry with the natives, creating a unique Chinese/native culture, like the mestizos of our timeline. And a sort of Colombian exchange occurs, with the Chinese introducing domesticated animals, new crops, horses, and inventions such as gunpowder. However, disease would also rack the natives, and all throughout what is now the western U.S., villages are decimated. Eventually, there is no more pure Chinese sailors left, as they have all either died or married with native women. China does not send any more men, as there is no motive for them to do so, and eventually a new unique culture arises in California. Cut off from their homeland, the Chinstezos, as we'll call them, forge a new civilization with Chinese technology and native culture. The native populations eventually build up an immunity from the diseases throughout 70 years, and if and when Columbus arrives, they easily beat him back, purely from huge numbers. Overall, native populations controlled the Americas with an assimilated Chinese civilization present on the west coast. Natives throughout the Americas adopt some parts of Chinese culture, and eventually empires such as the Aztecs and Incas will become on par with China as they adopt their technology. Okay, now back to the more interesting scenario, in which the Chinese actually land on the shores of the Aztec Empire. Since the Chinese would be landing in the early 1400s, they would have to land past 1428 to even find the Aztec Empire. So Zheng, on his last voyage in 1433, lands on the shores of present-day Mexico. The Aztec Empire, having been founded about 5 years later in the form of a triple alliance between three powerful cities in the Valley of Mexico, is still in its infancy. It was such a short time for development. The empire would still be in the course of expanding its territories and resources. The king of Tenochtitlan at that time, Itzoquatl, will likely be the figure to meet the Chinese. In the middle of empire building, Itzoquatl will be still cementing his rule in the Valley of Mexico, and the empire will be much tinier and less powerful than that by the 1500s, when Cortez conquered it. However, the Chinese will be impressed that such an advanced civilization could have existed without their knowledge for so long. Although the fact that the Aztecs didn't use wheels and metal weapons at the time would still show Chinese superiority over them, their mathematical and astronomical skills will be impressive to the Chinese. Also, although Tenochtitlan wouldn't have hundreds of thousands of people yet, it would still be a relatively advanced city, especially compared to the thousands to European cities. The warlike Itzoquatl would be appalled at the sight of 20,000 Chinese men streaming onto his shores, but with their more advanced technology, Chinese could easily subdue the Aztecs if a fight were to occur. Most likely, the Chinese would establish a permanent colony to demonstrate their power and collect tribute from the weaker Aztecs. They would give the empire technology in exchange for Aztec mathematical and astronomical skills. The Chinese colony would eventually be isolated from China, as the Hongul Emperor after Yongle would stop supplying the colony and see it as too expensive. And with the death of Zheng in 1433 and 1435, we're not really sure when he died, China further stops naval voyages. Meanwhile, back in North America, guess what? More disease. A large-scale epidemic wrecks North America, and the North populations rapidly decrease. But again, as in our timeline, with enough time, the natives recoup, and by 1492, most had built up an immunity. Columbus and his crew are slaughtered by hordes of Native Americans after he grows cruel towards them. Eventually, the Chinese colonists will spread throughout the continent with their Aztec counterparts, conquering other nations. After generations of growing up in the Americas and never hearing of China anymore, the colonists think of themselves as Native Americans as well. Perhaps if China solves its internal problems, it will eventually make contact with the colonists, but don't expect the large-scale colonization and assimilation efforts of some Europeans, such as the Spanish. There will never be mass numbers of Chinese fleeing to the New World unless some disaster of catastrophic proportions occur. Only when things get really bad, perhaps during the Opium Wars of the 1800s, would Chinese flee to the New World en masse. The important thing to keep in mind is that if any Chinese colonies were to exist, they would be close to the coast and will never penetrate the heart of the American continent. Indigenous groups will develop their own civilizations there, but hundreds of years ahead in the development due to Chinese technology. If Europeans were to ever show up, natives would have already developed gunpowder-based weapons that could or could not resemble guns, metal armor, and would ride commonly on horses. Like the Chinese, European colonies will be tiny enclaves on the American continent, trading with native societies. Americans will be a power in their own right. China doesn't really benefit from the colonies, but they would forever change American development and set it decades ahead of what it was when the Europeans arrived. Well, that's it. Signing off.